Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to something I'm calling Fair Shake. I don't know whether this will be a series or not, but this is the perfect film to start a possible series on. I'm going to talk about The Silence of the Lambs. I only have this Blu-ray from Kino disc only. Now, this series is, if it actually is a series, but certainly this video is about giving a film another chance that I have been critical of in the past. Now, for those of you who are new to the channel or have missed all the videos where I say Silence of the Lambs isn't a very good film, I'll just go over why I believe that and whether anything changed watching it again. Now, when it came out, obviously it swept the Oscars for some reason. There were stories of people fainting in the aisles at certain points, like when, spoiler alert, Anthony Hopkins touches Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster's finger. People were panicking and swooning in the theatres. And even now people give it 5-star reviews and say it's amazing. Now obviously everything's taste, and there's a lot of films that are classics that I just don't kind of get or connect, but I can see why they're classics. But Silence of the Lambs is one of those films I just don't understand why people think it's amazing. It's very much like The Departed by Scorsese. Now I will say, I still think Silence of the Lambs is like a 3-star film out of 5. It's not like The Departed, which I would give 1 out of 5. So that's baffling why people think The Departed is a great film, because it's bad on so many levels. So I'm not here to say Silence of the Lambs is a bad film, because it's not a bad film, but it's also not a great film. My history, I saw it when it came out. I saw it a couple of times when it came out, but I haven't seen it for probably about 20 years. But I watched it again just for the purpose of this exercise. Now again, if you don't know, I absolutely worship Manhunter by Michael Mann, the first proliferation of a Thomas Harris novel and film, with Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter. Now in this film, Hannibal Lecter is a supporting character. Brian Cox is only in about 3 scenes, whereas obviously Silence of the Lambs, almost Buffalo Bill, the active serial killer, played brilliantly by Ted Levine, he's almost the supporting character, and obviously Hannibal Lecter would go on in other films to almost become like an anti-hero, even though he is a psychopathic serial killer. Look how society has changed. So I am all about Manhunter. I saw it on VHS. It was a bomb. It only made half of its budget back. Sadly, not that Rotten Tomatoes matter, but if you take all the Hannibal Lecter films, Manhunter is still like middle of the pack for some reason. Yes, people talk about its dated 80s score, but I mean, that aside, it's arguably in the conversation for the greatest American film of the 80s, which is pretty good praise. So I am clearly biased towards Manhunter, but I'm trying to give Silence of the Lambs a fair shake. So I'm not going to mention Manhunter too much. So I mean, one of the problems with Silence of the Lambs, watching it again, trying to watch it in a vacuum. Is even the first credit of where we are, it literally says woods near Quantico, Virginia. It's like we can see Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling running through woods. We don't really need to be told she's in the woods. They could have just put near Quantico, but again, I'm being picky, but that's really annoying. One of my biggest problems is the portrayal of Chilton in the asylum. Now, I haven't read the Thomas Harris books, so I don't know whether in Red Dragon he was a sleazebag, but obviously he is portrayed by Anthony Heald in Silence of the Lambs as an absolute sleazebag. The way he tries to salaciously make comments towards Jodie Foster. All the men in this film, talk about the male gaze, all the men, the way they look at Jodie Foster in this film, especially in the funeral home, it's just like, it's a bit much, really. It's just overdone, but that's a different story. So I don't know whether in Red Dragon, or somebody can tell me, is Chilton a slime ball in Red Dragon? I know he's in Red Dragon, he's certainly in Manhunter less. Because if he's not, then what was the choice to make him a scumbag slime ball in Silence of the Lambs? But if he is that in the book, then fair play, that's fine. But I obviously prefer his portrayal as like a professional in Manhunter way better than this absolute scumbag sleazeball who happens to be in charge of a mental facility. So that's a huge problem for me. Scott Glenn is Crawford. Obviously there's a whole father substitute to Jodie Foster's character, Clarice Starling. But just simple things like Crawford's absolutely immaculate, his hair's always immaculate, his clothes. I mean, you would think with Michael Mann's history, Dennis Farina's Crawford would be wearing Armani suits and stuff, but no, he is frazzled and his tie's all over the place because he's under pressure to catch this killer. At no point do you really feel that Jack Crawford in Silence of the Lambs is like under any pressure to catch a serial killer. Either that he's a psychopath as well and his blood pressure never like goes up or whatever, because he's just like, and then obviously the relationship with Starling and the whole father substitute. So it's kind of choices that I have problems with in Silence of the Lambs. But again, I mean, as human beings, we always compare things and we always judge things on history and things. So again, obviously when Silence of the Lambs came out, the majority of people had never seen Manhunter, had never even heard of it. Even today, there's people who have just never heard of Manhunter, despite the fact that it's by Michael Mann, who's a fairly prominent American filmmaker. There's still people today, even in the world of the interweb, that have never heard of Manhunter. So obviously if Silence of the Lambs is the first thing you saw, but then I still can't get it into my head, if you've seen Silence of the Lambs and you've seen Manhunter, how you can not say Manhunter's better. But that's not what this is about. People are entitled to their own opinions, apparently. What a crazy world we live in. I had kind of forgotten that Howard Shore did the score, and when I saw that credit and listening to the score again, all I could think of was, I wish Cronenberg had made this, or David Lynch. There's a couple of David Lynch actors in it. No offence to Jonathan Demme, I like Jonathan Demme, but I think Cronenberg or David Lynch would have made a better film. But that's beside the point, because that's just living in a pipe dream. The film is shot kind of darkly and realistically, which is kind of the opposite of Manhunter, because Michael Mann's a very stylish director with colour choices, compositions in the frame, those wonderful shots when the television with the home videos are on it, dominating the screen, and Will Graham's just in the... But bizarrely, the overly stylistic Manhunter is more gritty and realistic than Silence of the Lambs, which is shot more grittily and realistically, if that makes any sense. I mean, there's just stuff that's really annoying. That's even before we get to Anthony Hopkins and his pantomime dame performance. Might as well get out of the way. The Flava Beans and Chianti, it's actually a good line, it's a funny line, but then the histrionics after it completely undermine the seriousness of it. The whole, it's a pantomime villain performance, and anybody who says otherwise is welcome to their opinion. Now, I know I was watching an essay on YouTube by a professional kind of film critic or film analyst, and he did make out the point that Manhunter and Silence of the Lambs, it's two different lectures, it's two different performances that were needed. But I still think Brian Cox's Lecter in Silence of the Lambs would have been more effective than Anthony Hopkins' Lecter in Manhunter. So yes, it's a different Lecter performance. Lecter is supposed to be a bit bigger and a bit more expressive in Silence of the Lambs because he's in it a lot more than Brian Cox is in Manhunter. I get that, but it's such a pantomime performance for me. And that's why, again, Oscars don't matter. But as you may or may not know about this channel, or about me, I like underdogs. My channel is a niche of a niche of a niche. So when you start giving out Oscars for things, not that Oscars matter, but to say Anthony Hopkins got an Oscar for this performance is funny to me. Jodie Foster's good, but the accent's not. Anthony Heald is just... I mean, if that's what the character's like in the books, okay, but it just seems so bizarre. And also the production design choices for the asylum, the gothic, the slimy walls, it's just... It is, obviously Silence of the Lambs is for a mainstream audience. Not that Manhunter is an art house film or anything, but obviously Michael Mann has a much better idea of the construction of shots, the use of architecture in shots, the fact he used an art museum for the asylum as opposed to going for the gothic dungeon. But again, I'm trying not to mention Manhunter, but it's hard not to. I mean, even in the back of this Scream Factory edition, it says Manhunter is superior to the Silence of the Lambs. But again, we're not talking about Manhunter. We're talking about rewatching Silence of the Lambs, giving Silence of the Lambs a fair shake, which it sounds like I totally am doing. Ted Levine is fantastic. I would have preferred to have seen more Ted Levine than more Anthony Hopkins. Obviously, Ed Gein does play a big part in Hollywood history. The real life Wisconsin killer who inspired Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho and Deranged, and there's an element in Silence of the Lambs, of course. But it's also, with Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, about that transformation and gender switching. Now in 1991, obviously, transgender issues, or transsexual, as the word is mentioned in Silence of the Lambs. I don't think you're allowed to use the word transsexual anymore, are you? And again, it's that fear of the other, fear of strangeness, and obviously in 1991, the thought of a man wanting to be a woman wasn't in the kind of zeitgeist as much as trans issues are nowadays. And obviously Psycho plays on that, Texas Chainsaw Massacre plays on that, and obviously Silence of the Lambs plays on that, because Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine, is obviously killing women to make a flesh suit for himself so he can become a woman. Whereas in Manhunter, the Tooth Fairy is butchering families. But I'm not talking about Manhunter. So after all of that, it does star George Romero and Roger Corman and Charles Napier. And it's always good to see them giving wonderful performances. And Chris Isaak as a SWAT team member. This was before he would go on to be his own FBI agent in David Lynch's Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. So watching it again after probably 20 years, again, it's a good film. There's effective set pieces in it. On the most part, the performances are good, with a couple of horrendous exceptions. But again, it's just fascinating. And yes, as I've said before, I am biased as hell towards Manhunter. I'd probably seen Manhunter at least 15 times before I'd seen Silence of the Lambs. So of course, not that I like to admit it, but sometimes I'm human, and we have our own biases, and biases that we just can't see clearly without them. But Silence of the Lambs, watching it again, it's still a good film. Again, I've mentioned it's kind of similar to The Departed in the sense of I just do not understand how people love The Departed, not just like The Departed, but love The Departed. But as I said, Silence of the Lambs is way better than The Departed. It is a good film. Is it a great film in my eyes? Is it a classic? The Kino disc has a ton of extras, including a 10-year kind of retrospective looking back, where everybody involved says it's a masterpiece and everybody says it's a classic, and I just don't really understand why. But again, that's fair. There's plenty of films. I'll probably do an episode on this series if it is a series. The next one would probably be 8.5, because I have only just watched 8.5 once, and again, I just thought it was good, whereas 8.5 is beloved. It's always in the greatest films of all time, as Silence of the Lambs. Probably not as high as 8.5. I liked 8.5. It had a great opening, great ending, bits in the middle, but again, I'm obviously willing to give it a fair shake. Perhaps I'll probably give 8.5 in retrospect a fairer shake than I'm giving Silence of the Lambs. But it's more the choices that are made. Now again, if all of the choices that are made in Silence of the Lambs all came from the book, that's one thing. But, a director does have the power to say to actors, take it down a little bit, give me a little bit more. So it's those kind of choices that I just have problems with in Silence of the Lambs, including the bit where Lecter escapes. Spoiler alert, but I'm assuming most people have seen Silence of the Lambs by this time. It is 33 years old. Is that right? Wow. The bit where the cops come in and realise Lecter's gone, they literally have a Charlie's Angels intro where they're all pointing their guns at different directions, and it's like literally the Charlie's Angels, and it's like, what? Because, not to compare, but Michael Mann spends so much time preparing and you know stuff like that he would get right, rather than a much more Hollywoody, mainstreamy, let's do a Charlie's Angels intro where everybody points in a different direction with their gun. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. But obviously this is giving Silence of the Lambs a fair shake. Still a good film. But just for me, still has huge problems. But again, this is just a bit of fun. This is me giving Silence of the Lambs a fair shake. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Try not to be too harsh. Again, this is just my opinion, and my opinion is not fact. I'll have to get a t-shirt or a tea towel printed with that on it. So this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.